People who bring it to the video for the ICC championship game between Texas and Georgia. And starting with coaching, both teams are obviously in really good shape here. They've each got a top five head coach in the country now, I would say, and they've also got a great coaching staff that each team does. And still, though, Kirby Smart, I do think, is a better head coach than Steve Sarkisian is by a little bit. And in a game like this, there's not another head coach that's still coaching right now that I would rather have coaching my team than Kirby Smart. And defensively, I thought that Texas would take a little bit of a step back this year because they lost some really good players in their front seven, but that's not been the case at all. Their defense is better than it was last year. It's the second best defense in the country and the best defense in the SEC. They're only giving up 10.25 points per game on average. And Georgia's defense at times has played really well, like against Texas and against Clemson, but at times it hasn't played very well, like last week against Georgia Tech, and then against Mississippi State, and the first half against Alabama. And offensively, both of these teams, I think, have been a disappointment. Texas's offense has been inconsistent, and so is Georgia's. Texas only scored 20 against Arkansas, which was bad, and then only 17 against A&M, which was bad, even though A&M's defense is more talented than Arkansas's is. And then they only scored 27 against Vanderbilt, which was not very good. And then Georgia's offense, was terrible in the Kentucky game when they only scored 13. And then against Ole Miss, even though Ole Miss has a great defense, only scoring 10 is never good. So at quarterback in this game, both of these quarterbacks, Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers, with Dylan Gabriel, were the top contenders for the Heisman Trophy going into this season. But both quarterbacks, I think, have been a little bit of a disappointment this season. So Carson Beck does have a lot of yards. He's got 3,429 yards passing this season, but his completion percentage is down by over 7% from what it was last year. And his yards per throw average is down from 9.5 last year to now 7.9. But good news is the last three games he hasn't thrown an interception. And then Quinn Ewers has in 10 games this year 2,307 yards passing, and that is good. But if you look at his numbers from last season, that is not very good. And his yards per throw averages went down too, from 8.8 last year to now 7.5 this year. And I saw that Arch Manning is going to play some in this game. And if Quinn Ewers struggles, I wouldn't be surprised if Sarkisian has Manning take over because Manning is a better runner than Ewers is. And Georgia has struggled to stop the quarterback run this year. Like just last week against Georgia Tech, their quarterback rushed for 110 yards on Georgia. And at wide receiver, Georgia has had a lot of trouble with drop balls this season, but they're very solid at wide receiver. So Dominic Lovett, I would say, is probably their best receiver. He's been a good receiver in the SEC for 3 years now. But Arian Smith is their fastest receiver and their main deep ball catcher. He's had a good season this year. and one of Georgia's transfer wide receivers, Colby Young, who hasn't played since week 5 because of a suspension. I saw is still going to be out with a suspension. And the other transfer receiver that Georgia brought in this year from Vanderbilt, London Humphreys, has just been a complete bust this season. Now, Dylan Bell, Georgia's shorter yardage receiver, has had a good season, and he returned last week from an injury. And Texas is a wide receiver room. If I was a fan of them, I would be a little disappointed. Their best receiver this year has been Matthew Golden, a Houston transfer. He's got 39 catches for 576. But Isaiah Bond, the most talented of the three transfer receivers that they brought in, has been a disappointment. He didn't even have a catch last week against Texas A&M, and he only has 32 catches in 11 games this season. And then Silas Bowden, the other transfer receiver that Texas brought in, was a great receiver for Oregon State last year, and this year only has 19 catches with Texas. He's not been used very much. And Ryan Wingo, the 5-star freshman receiver, hasn't done a lot either this year. He only has 21 catches. So I guess both teams are about the same at wide receiver, but Georgia's gotten more production out of theirs than Texas has. Now Texas has an advantage at tight end. Their tight end Gunnar Helm has had a great season, and he's actually their best pass catcher. He's got 600 yards receiving on 48 catches this year, and Georgia's best tight end this year has been Lawson Lucky, but he doesn't have a big numbers. Tight ends for Georgia have been a pretty big disappointment this season. And at running back, I saw Georgia's top runner, Trevor Etienne, is expected to play in this game. And if not, it'll be Nate Frazier getting most of the carries, who's had a pretty good freshman season. But Georgia's been dealing with a lot of injuries this year at the running back position. And for Texas, Quintravian Wisner, since C.J. Baxter has been out with an injury, has turned into their top running back. Even though he wasn't a real high recruit, he's got over 800 yards rushing this season, and he's had over 300 yards rushing combined in these last two games. He had 158 against Kentucky, and then 186 against A&M. And he's also got Jaden Blue and Jarrett Gibson, who are good running backs to help him out. Jaden Blue, before the season began, and before C.J. Baxter got hurt, was expected to be the number 2 running back behind Baxter. And then when Baxter got hurt, Blue was expected to be the starter, but Wisner beat him. So now Blue is the number 2 running back still. But at the running back position, Texas might have a little bit of an advantage. But at the line of scrimmage, Texas's the offensive line has played great all season, except for when they played against Georgia, where they got dominated, and that's concerning, obviously, for Texas. And this game, their offensive line is going to have to play much better for them to have a chance to win this one. And for most of the season, Texas's offensive line has played better than Georgia's has. Georgia's offensive line has played great at times, and it's as talented as Texas's is, but it's also not played very well at times, and has overall been a little bit of a disappointment, in my opinion. Like in the Ole Miss game, Ole Miss is defensive line did to Georgia what Georgia's did to Texas. And Texas, though, its best offensive lineman, Kelvin Banks, who's going to be a first round pick next year, did get hurt against A&M, and I saw is questionable to play in this game. They will badly need him for this one. And on the defensive line, Texas's best player is Alfred Collins, and they've got some other good ones though too. Just probably not another one that I would call elite. And then Georgia's got good defensive linemen like Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson and Tyrone Ingram Dawkins. Those are all good players, but the one elite defensive lineman that they have, you probably know, is Michael Williams. And him and linebacker Jalen Walker are Georgia's two best pass rushers. They gave Texas a nightmare when they played this season. Those two combined for 5 sacks in that game. Texas has got to have come up with some plan to be able to handle those two because they obviously weren't ready for them when they played before. So on the defensive line, I guess both teams are pretty similar. And at linebacker for Georgia, of course, Jalen Walker has had a great season. And Smile Munden, since he's been back, has been playing great. He had a huge game against Georgia Tech with 13 tackles and a sack. And C.J. Allen has done great for Georgia at linebacker in his first season as a full-time starter. He's tied with another player for most tackles on the team with 65. And Chaz Chambliss has done a good job at linebacker too this season for Georgia. And Texas's best linebacker is Anthony Hill, and Anthony Hill is the best linebacker in this game. He's one of the best in the country. He's had an amazing season. He's one of the best pass rushers in the country. Too, he leads Texas in tackles this year with 84, and he also has a 7.5 sacks this season. But Texas has got some other good linebackers too. I wouldn't say they have another elite one besides Hill. So at linebacker, Georgia may have an advantage in this game. And then in the secondary, Texas's secondary was bad last season, but they've turned their secondary this year into an elite secondary. They're only giving up on average 143.7 yards passing per game, and part of that is to do with the addition of Andrew Maguba at safety from Clemson. He's done a great job for them this season, and him and Michael Tefe are one of the best safety combinations in the country. And then Georgia's Malachi Starks at safety is tied with C.J. Allen for the most tackles on the team, and Dan Jackson has done a good job at safety for Georgia too this season. He had a big game against Georgia Tech with 6 tackles, and he was the one that had that forced fumble. And then KJ Bolden, the number one safety recruit of 2024, has been a big help to Georgia's defense this year too. So at the safety position, they're pretty similar. Um, and then at cornerback, I would give Texas the advantage. Jahdae Barron and Malik Muhammad are one of the best cornerback combinations in the country. And for Georgia, their best corner is Dalen Everett, but they don't really have an elite corner this year. I don't think just good. Uh, so I could see this game going either way, and I do think that this game will be a four-quarter game, and I do think Texas's offensive line will play a little better this time than it did last time against Georgia, but I just trust Georgia more in this game, and I think that they're going to win. I've got Georgia getting the win, 27-17 over Texas. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe, and I'll be back soon.